Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. In this episode, I will make a call on what I think is going to happen in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Which I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
I'm recording this on Sunday, November 3rd. It will come out early Monday morning, November 4th, the day before the 2024 American presidential election. I originally wanted to do a live stream with a decision desk format where we get a few of our previous guests together and go over the results as they come in. And I would still love to do this, but it's a bigger project than I anticipated. So I'll probably do a Twitter space on election night with some of the same people. It'll be on my timeline, so look out for that if you want a break from the slick and professional coverage that the media usually has, and you'd like to see how the Did Nothing Wrong crew does with it. So I'm going to do something crazy for this episode instead. I'm going to go on the record and make a call about what's going to happen tomorrow. And we'll all see how close I get. Feel free to mock me for the next 4 years if I completely blow it. But I really think we're at a point now where we know what's about to happen. If you want the top-level summary, I think Harris is going to win, and it won't be close. I think she's going to take at least one state that nobody is calling her to take right now, and I think this thing is going to be over relatively quickly. If you want to find out how I came to that conclusion and why I think this is going to happen, keep listening. I want to get into my process a little bit here because I think it's important to explain how I got to the conclusion I'm at with all of this. One of the things that I do to put this podcast together is to start with an idea. And then I try to come up with a reason why it's wrong. It saves me a lot of time and embarrassment because we have enough people tuning in now that when you put yourself out there like this, someone's going to catch it if you mess up. And let's be honest, I don't like being wrong. Obviously, I've been wrong about stuff in the past on this podcast, but I really try and keep those things few and far between. You can't be right all the time. Nobody is. But I do my damnedest to be. Even if I don't like the conclusion that I'm coming to, I still try to be intellectually honest about reality. And hopefully that comes through in the final product that you hear every week. There's been plenty of things cut from the final mix because I couldn't fact check it to my satisfaction. I don't care if people disagree with my conclusions about things, but I want to be sure that I'm coming to those conclusions from a factual and accurate place. I studied broadcasting in college in a program that actually took it seriously. And while I don't think I would call myself a journalist per se, I do try to live up to that standard. I'm definitely coming from an ideological place, but I'm not going to lie about it or lie about the people I disagree with. Part of trying to prove myself wrong is reading as much as I can from both sides of an issue. That means sometimes I have to read and listen to some pretty vile people with some absolutely dog shit opinions about stuff because I want to make sure I'm portraying them correctly. And I really try to be fair. You don't need to exaggerate or misquote guys like Jack Posobiec or Nick Fuentes. The things that they actually say are bad enough. And when you listen to hours of their dog shit opinions and you read their fascist books, you start to get a pretty good idea of how they think. And sometimes you can get an idea of what's on their upcoming agenda. Put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. One of the other things that's sort of a byproduct of reading and listening to a whole bunch of disparate data sources is that sometimes you get a 50,000 foot view of the situation because you're truly seeing the takes from all sides. You aren't as reliant on some writer from, just say, The Atlantic to come up with a think piece explaining what this or that group of extremists or people are up to, because you're seeing what they're saying in their Telegram channels in real time. So there's plenty of times when I've seen an article in some mainstream publication and known right off the bat that it was not only wrong, but that it's a setup to make some journalists take the bait and write a bad story, which further erodes the credibility of the media. And the reason I know this is because I was watching the conversations that the folks that set this person up were having about setting this person up. I've had people try to set me up for things like that, and I'm fully aware just how common a tactic it is. But in my opinion, the way you avoid that kind of thing is to read a tremendous amount of material about the stuff you're covering. You got to really, really know about the stuff you're talking about. And if you do, it's a lot harder for someone else to sell you some nonsense. And you also get a picture of what's going on in a lot of places that aren't necessarily getting a whole lot of sunlight. Like, for example, about a year and a half ago, I started seeing a lot of stories about how the various state Republican parties were broke. They had virtually no money coming in, and they had spent a lot of what they had on things like fancy headquarters buildings in Arizona, and they were spending a lot of the rest of the money on lawsuits between the various principals involved, with both sides accusing the other of being corrupt scumbags. This pattern was repeating all across the country. Now, by itself, that might not mean much. Donations are very cyclical. Sometimes an off cycle isn't the best time to look at a party's finances, caveat, 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 caveat. But to see this kind of common theme all across the country leads one to the conclusion that they're not exactly running a tight ship over there, and that the people that are in charge might be more interested in the amount of money that they can siphon off for themselves and their friends, rather than actually electing candidates to office. It had the feel of a bust out, which in the organized crime sense of the word, which is how I'm using it, means taking over a business and leveraging its credit and its assets to take as much money as possible out of the business before leaving it to file for bankruptcy. Now, the more I looked at it, the more signs I saw that that was what was going on. The state parties were raising what looked like record amounts of money, but they were transferring almost all of it back to the Republican National Committee, which at the time was controlled by Trump. They had a revenue sharing agreement, which was letting Trump use the money to pay for his various expenses, including his lawyers. Needless to say, if you're spending campaign contributions on defense lawyers, you're not spending those contributions on electing candidates. And in previous cycles, the state parties were the backbone of the local get out the vote operation. You need strong organizations at the local level to be able to motivate people to actually go in and do things like knock on doors and put up signs and leave flyers and all that boring stuff that can actually lead to a pretty big percentage on election day. And the people that had taken over the state parties were neglecting that in favor of sending more money to Donald Trump. So that's not good. But don't worry, they figured out a way to centralize it, and they've outsourced the canvassing operation to a PAC, America PAC, that happens to be run by Elon Musk, who, of course, we all know he's rich, he's successful, and he will definitely figure out a way to disrupt the existing process. These guys all love their disruption, and Elon's here to disrupt the way campaigns do get out the vote. Well, there's a recent article in Wired magazine with an inside look into that PAC and how they are approaching the ground canvassing operation, and it resembles nothing so much as a human trafficking operation. They hired folks from California and Florida, flew them out to Michigan, and once they got there, they told them what they were doing and for who. And I'm not going to recap the entire article here, but I'll link it in the show notes because I think it's really worth reading. It explains to you just what a cheapjack cut rate operation these people were actually running. They had a bunch of predominantly African-American people crammed into the back of a U-Haul van with no seats. They told them that they would only get paid if they had a certain amount of doors. If not, they would have to pay for their own hotel rooms and then their own tickets back to wherever they were from. And then when this story broke, they all got fired and left to fend for themselves thousands of miles from home. This is your canvassing operation in Michigan, which is definitely a swing state. And if somehow Trump manages to win it, and make no mistake, it was winnable for him at one point, it makes Harris's path to the White House a whole lot harder. And this isn't the only hiccup in the otherwise smooth-running machine or anything. We're hearing stories about canvassers submitting thousands of fake voter contacts, being in a restaurant, using the Wi-Fi to claim you're out hitting doors. The software they're using to ostensibly track all of these contacts is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And they're putting the best spin on this that they can by saying they're monitoring the situation in other ways, but it doesn't appear to be improving. So one gets the impression, looking at this data, that they don't know what they're doing, and that the purpose of these operations isn't necessarily to knock on as many doors as possible to get the vote out for Trump, as it is to make as much money as possible for the people who are running the PAC. So there's that. But that's not insurmountable if your people are motivated enough to come out anyway, and they don't need a whole lot of canvassing. However, what if the other side is more motivated? What if the other side legitimately feels that they are what Sun Tzu calls in The Art of War, death ground? In his chapter on the 9 types of ground that battles can be fought on, Sun Tzu describes death ground as, quote, ground in which the army survives only if it fights with the courage of desperation is called death. And this may sound melodramatic, but there's a lot of women in America who feel that things like the Dobbs decision, the one that repealed Roe versus Wade, and the push to ban things like birth control, like IVF, like no-fault divorce, and the folks in MAGA that think it's really funny to shitpost about repealing the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage and their right to vote, all add up to the idea that they are legitimately under attack. And if they don't fight back, they will be forced back at least a century in terms of basic human rights. And the Harris campaign has been genius about seizing on this as a theme, using the slogan, "We're not going back," which I think will go down in history as one of the most brilliant campaign slogans ever. Because, and I don't want to mansplain this, but from everyone I've talked to and everything I've read, it really does sum up what a lot of women are feeling right now in this country. And right now, women are voting. The most recent polls I've seen of the 6 states that track early voting by gender consistently have women coming out at a 53% rate to men's 47%. And what this says is that women are extremely motivated this time around. And I haven't seen anything anywhere that indicates it's because they're coming out to support Trump. In fact, there's a really good case to be made that a lot of Republican women have crossed over and voted for Harris. And this is a possibility that Republicans are freaking out extremely hard about. You look at the Haley voters and the idea that there was at least 13% consistently of the national Republican primary electorate that was not voting for Trump. Even after it was a done deal, Haley was still polling between 10 and 20% in the primaries. And at least some of those people were voting for Haley because they couldn't stand Trump. And I'm not sure I've seen an argument from that side that says that these people would have come home. So there is some non-negligible percentage, nobody's quite sure what it is, it's impossible to know, of Republican primary voters that have decided we're never Trump. We would vote for Kamala Harris. We would vote for a sponge. We would vote for a rock in the White House rather than Donald Trump. And you can see this because there's a lot of Republicans that are freaking out really hard about this. And they're trying to convince women that, yeah, maybe you don't want to do this. You've got guys like Jesse Waters from Fox saying that women who don't tell their husbands that they're voting for Harris is tantamount to them having an affair. And this is the same Jesse Waters that had an affair with one of his producers, who's now his second wife, so I guess he's kind of an expert. You have noted serial adulterer Newt Gingrich saying the same thing. You know, the guy who insisted on discussing terms of divorce with his second wife as she was in the hospital, recovering from surgery for uterine cancer. Women know this, and they're not buying it. The numbers bear this out at this point in the campaign. And not only do the numbers bear it out, but the panicked responses on the part of the MAGA influencers also indicate that they know it as well. Just this week, you've got Mike Cernovich, Jack Posobiec, and Charlie Kirk all imploring and pleading for men to come out and vote, saying if they don't, then the whole thing is over. And seeing how a big part of Trump's strategy this time around has been relying on low propensity male voters to come out, voters that don't necessarily vote in every election or haven't voted before, first-time voters in a lot of cases, you're gambling that these people are going to come out and vote for your guy when they've never voted or they don't vote often. That's really starting to look a lot like a gamble against some pretty bad odds right now. Things are to the point where the early voting exit polling is so far in Harris's favor that it's actually kind of hard to believe. Over the weekend, the Des Moines Register, that hippie lefty rag out there, ran their final Iowa poll, and they have Harris 4 points ahead in Iowa. Folks, if we're in a place where Harris wins Iowa, it's over, and it's not going to be close. They would need a landslide of votes on Election Day that, based on the numbers that people like Simon Rosenberg and Tom Bonnier from TargetSmart have crunched about which people are voting and when, just isn't out there. If you're not familiar with Simon and Tom, they're the guys that shot down the entire red wave theory in both 2020 and 2022. And one of the ways that they came up with the numbers they came up with was simply looking at a lot of the early voting numbers and seeing who's already voted and what that might mean. Now, the traditional polls are a lot closer than this. And there's been some really interesting speculation about why. Not only does it appear that there's a certain amount of what they're now referring to as herding going on, where nobody wants to be too wrong or too far off, so everybody's calling it really close. But the problem with that is that there's been a tremendous amount of MAGA-aligned polls this cycle, even more so than the previous two cycles. And it seems that people have actually caught on that you can put polls out there and use them to create the narrative that you want. You look at Polymarket, which is a foreign betting site. It is a predictive betting site on the election. We've covered this before. It was financed in the first round by Founders Fund, which is Peter Thiel. They hired Nate Silver, formerly of 538. They've hyped this innumerable amount of times in the media this cycle, saying Polymarket odds say this. And what it's come down to is there's 4 accounts that are betting a whole lot of money on that site on Donald Trump. And they may all be connected to one account in France that's betting a whole lot of money on Trump. And as a result, they get headlines every single time they do it. They get this big push of, Polymarket says this, people are actually betting. And you've got people like Elon Musk gassing that number up, saying, people are actually putting their own money in, it matters. So a lot of what you're seeing in the polls when you hear, it's close, or, Trump's ahead, is honestly smoke. And it seems like, they've caught on that you can put polls out there and use them to create the narrative that you want, which in this case is that the race is really close and that Trump's ahead. Even though by all objective measurements, that's not the case, this is what they want out there. So this is the narrative that they're putting out there. Now, the question we got to ask is, why does Trump want that narrative out there? And I think the answer is pretty simple. They have known for some time that they probably weren't going to be able to win on the merits this year. They didn't last time, and the demographics as well as the basic reality on the ground have not shifted in their favor. So their strategy is going to be to try to litigate it. They are going to cry about voter fraud, using the idea that the polls were close, yet the final result wasn't, as an argument to try and convince various state legislatures not to certify the results, but instead to send Trump-friendly electors to Washington for the Electoral College. They would really like to be able to move this thing into the House of Representatives, where they still have a majority, and then elect Trump from there. And they've hinted at as much. And I think that if that's what we're looking at come January, we need to say no. Loudly, in person, peacefully. That part's important, but loudly. Because if this happens and it's allowed to stand and the Supreme Court okays it 6-3, then we're Venezuela. We're Russia. We are no longer a democracy. We no longer elect the president by a vote of the people. And that means all bets are off, because the basic compact under which we are organized no longer exists. Nobody with any sense wants this. So, if we're seeing the signs of this happening, then it's time to start planning a peaceful response. We don't want another January 6th, but we don't want to let democracy go. So if you haven't already, go vote this Tuesday, November 5th, and be ready for what might come next. Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GRZABJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.